I am a nerd, I must admit. I am also, believe it or not, black. These two things are surprisingly not as mutually exclusive as you might imagine, as popular entertainment might lead us to believe, but I find that each of them help me to mutually inform the other. Each of them help for me to gain a deeper kind of understanding of who I am as an individual. Being black helps me gain deeper insights into nerd culture. Being a nerd helps me to have a very unique and quirky sensibility of being black. And I like that. I like that dynamic back and forth. As has been indicated, I will be talking with us today about science fiction. And I think in order to do this, in order to facilitate the conversation about science fiction, I'd like to pose two questions to you all as an audience. Two questions and a corollary. These will require you to think and visit your inner self. The first question is rather simple, it's rather straightforward. What is science fiction? What is science fiction? I ask this question to my students all the time. Many of them will pose responses based on what they imagine science fiction is about. They'll tell me science fiction is about aliens, it's about the future, it's about a high school version of dystopia, visions of understandings a la the Hunger Games and Divergent and what have you. Fascinating depictions of things to come. And yet, they're not necessarily wrong about this. Science fiction can be about very many things. That's one of the things that makes the genre so fascinating. It is a genre that is deeply invested in the speculative imaginary. It helps us to imagine the future. Now, arguably, though, science fiction is also very much about the present. It's very much about the here and now. One of the things that I use to help my students understand this is that it is, in many instances, also looking further back, the past made present by means of the future. And we're going to revisit this in just a moment. But I promise two questions. The second question, can you remember the very first science fiction work that you ever encountered? As you think back, perhaps you maybe recall your first time sitting down to watch Star Wars. Maybe the first time you sat down to watch Star Trek. Hopefully, if you watched Star Wars for the first time, it was the original trilogy and not the prequels that we don't talk about. But yes, and as I think back on these futures of days past, one of the things that comes to my mind, of course, is my father, being the Trekkie that he is, being the OG nerd of Clan Brickler that he is sitting us down to watch Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Now, this is, certainly it has its merits and has its values, and, I will always say DS9 over Generations and the OG Star Trek also. But what really struck me about science fiction actually goes to my own personal experience. I am a child of the 80s. I am an 80s baby. And the 80s are sort of the golden age of science fiction style Saturday morning cartoons. Anything that you turned on between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m. on a Saturday morning was guaranteed to have lasers and robots and all of these wonderful things that help make your childhood so magical. So me, also being rather unique, one of my favorite versions of these Saturday morning cartoons was Robotech. I know that this is taking somebody back. The coolest thing about Robotech was not so much that it was just the usual brand of saccharine laser fire and alien invasions or whatever, but as we can see in the center of the little triptych that we have up here, it is the giant robot. And not only a giant robot, but a giant transforming robot. Truly amazing. And this is actually one of the other fascinating things that I would find out later in my life. This is a version of what we would call anime. It's a Japanese form of animation, and more specifically, even within the genre of anime, it's what's known as a mecha series, M-E-C-H-A, mecha. And this would go on to be one of my most favorite and cherished science fiction touchstones. Watching Robotech as a child, watching Gundam as an adolescent, watching Neon Genesis Evangelion to really blow my mind, and really just finding all of these instances of giant robots and seeing the way in which they help tell very compelling stories. Now, I want us to continue to think as to what science fiction might mean as I indicated to us very early on, science fiction is, again, the past made present by means of the future. For me personally, one of the reasons that I enjoy anime so much is that it allows us to gain access and insights into Japanese culture. It allows us to see a very different brand of past articulated through the future, looking back in this regard to see forward. And to me, as it helps me understand and unpack these notions of identity, as it allows me to unpack and understand notions of history, the way in which just the giant robot serves as this vehicle for technology in and of itself, it becomes rather compelling. It becomes a really helpful means for critical engagement with the future. Incidentally, though, again, and I want to reiterate the significance of this, because this question of the past as allegorized through the future begs a lot of questions. There's a lot of questions inherently bound up in this. Primary amongst these is, whose past are we articulating through the lens of the future? Is it simply, a Eurocentric Anglo-American style future grounded in an understanding of empire, imperialism, age of discovery rhetoric, and pushing boundaries? Is that simply it? Or can we look at a Japanese perspective and gain deeper insights into what the beginning of the atomic age and militarism might mean in that context? Now, of course, as I indicated to you all very early on, I am Black, and that is something that I find to be very proud of. And African American when I'm feeling professional, as I may have indicated, right? One of the things that also is very cool about Blackness is that it has its own very deep-rooted historical context. Being Black is to be a product of larger traditions, traditions that cross oceans, traditions that cross time, traditions that transcend simply the narratives of slavery in the American South and in the Caribbean. Histories that also encompass cultures, belief systems, ideologies, epistemologies of the African continent. Now, I keep talking about this past and future thing. Those of us who may be in the know will know that I'm sort of signifying on this notion of Sankofa, which is, as a West African ideogram, it helps us to look back in order to move forward. I bring up Africa, I bring up African America, I bring up what we would call the African diaspora to help us get situated for a different take on science fiction. There is a term that is gaining a lot of cachet recently. This is a term that some of you all may have encountered. It's a term called Afrofuturism. Now, this term is one that I really want to try and unpack really briefly for us today. It is a term that has had a host of scholars doing very good and productive work, whether it's Alondra Nelson, whether it's Kodo Aishan, whether it's a host of scholars who are investigating this notion of what a Black future might mean. But the term itself derives from Mark Derry's 1993 essay, and you all are gonna maybe cringe or groan at this title, but it's become de rigueur amongst Afrofuturists, Black to the Future. This was a 1993 essay that Derry put together, and it was a way of situating a series of conversations that he had with a number of Black science fiction writers. In it, Derry coins the term Afrofuturism. And the definition is a little bit dense, but we're gonna get through it, and we'll unpack it momentarily. Derry defines Afrofuturism as speculative fiction that treats with African-American concerns and addresses African-American ideas within the context of 20th century technoculture, or African-American signification that appropriates images of a technological future through the use of prosthetics, a prosthetically enhanced future, might, for want of a better term, be called Afrofuturism. Now, this is dense, and this is very academic-y. So let's parse this. One of the things that Derry does very well is investigate how we might consider prosthesis in the future. And many of us, we also know that prosthesis in the context of science fiction is often rendered in conversation with notions of the cyborg, to put a new body part on you, right? If you lose your arm, you are given a mechanical prosthesis. This is very cyberpunk. This is very sort of notions of the body is not necessarily being entirely hermetically sealed. However, we're going to come back to this in just a moment also. The biggest thing that Derry doesn't quite get at in his definition is the notion of African diaspora. He describes it solely in terms of African American experience. The African diaspora, for those of us who may not know, is the forced dispersal of peoples from the African continent as a result of the primal severance of slavery and bondage. This act of severing people from the continent leads to their dispersal amongst the Caribbean, amongst North America, South America, and various places around the world. So Afrofuturism inherently takes on a rather global dimension. And it also allows us to continue to look back, to look forward. You might know the term Afrofuturism or might have heard it in passing in relationship to perhaps its most visible and most profound and profitable iteration that we've seen recently, which is, of course, Black Panther. Forever. Black Panther works as Afrofuturism because it engages with these notions of the future through the traditions of the African continent. It invests in a deeper understanding of what it means to be African, what it means to be a person of African descent, and it allows us to look forward into the future through those traditions without the interruptions of colonialism, without the, and I say interruptions, of course, this is not to make light of it. Honestly, the invasions of colonial domination certainly become a global tragedy. We also look at the way in which slavery becomes another tragedy that forestalls African development and African technogenesis and African futures. Wakanda, the futuristic nation that sits at the heart of Black Panther as a film, presents an Africa without that. And we see a lot of technological marvels. We see elements of mechanical prosthesis, we see elements of the future, and it becomes a wonderland. It becomes an almost utopia of just landscapes wherein we can celebrate the future as articulated through the traditions of the African past. And I find that to be really compelling. The film's director, Ryan Coogler, situates the thesis of Black Panther in a site of tension between tradition and innovation. Here again, between past and future. Now this tension functions to help us see all over again, right? The way in which the African diaspora can be reimagined, reinterpreted, re-articulated. We see the character of the antagonist, Eric Killmonger, who is a diasporic citizen. He is someone who is living in America and yet must come back to Africa in order to claim his birthright. And not only does he come back to Africa, he comes back to Africa and engages with the technological prostheses and technological enhancements of the Black Panther suit, the powered armor that he wears. So in this regard, to travel back to Africa to heal the primal wound of diaspora, you must be healed through technological prosthesis, a prosthetically enhanced future. I find this to be really cool, but also it's important for us to bear in mind, Black Panther didn't emerge ex nihilo from the imaginations of the creators. Black Panther has had, by virtue of its relationship with Afrofuturism, many antecedent works that have a quite long and storied history. So my work and my scholarship deals with the Afrofuturist literature. I investigate novels that explore science fiction from the perspective of Black folks on a sort of global scale. I have a couple of example texts for us up here, just in case you leave the TED Talk and you want to go find some books on Black science fiction. The first of which is Black No More, which is one of the older articulations of Black science fiction, Afrofuturist literature. George Schuyler, the author, writing in 1931, describes a scenario, an alternative way of adapting technology, wherein Black folks can scientifically and mechanically and technologically turn themselves white. And then that ends racism and everybody lives happily ever after. Of course not. And the novel explores all of the tensions and problems that exist as a result of this. It is an investigation of technology and its relationship with the Black experience in America, whatever that might be, and how that makes itself manifest through the possibilities of the future. I have also up here Octavia Butler's novel Wild Seed. Octavia Butler, as an author, is someone who is well recognized within the science fiction community. She is one of the most prominent Black women writers of science fiction and has been for some time, writing as far back as 1980 and even further back in terms of some of her more early works. Wild Seed situates itself within a series of novels, the Patternist series, that investigate how technology and its relationship with people of color, Black women and Black men as well, help to create a narrative of immortality, right? Long life, psychic powers, and what have you. It's a fascinating work. This one in particular is invested in exploring the transatlantic slave trade, exploring slavery itself, and looking at alternate ways that this might have been experienced and understood. The last novel up here. This one is the most fun, I think. My dissertation research is dealing with Stephen Barnes as an author. Stephen Barnes began writing in the early 1980s, writing parallel with the science fiction literary movement known as cyberpunk. I like to think he writes cyberfunk. You put some soul on it, right? And in this novel, Barnes investigates the notion of what does a cyborg Black man look like? What does that mean? What are the implications of taking a Black body and investing it with these prosthetic enhancements, these augmentations, and what have you? So again, this ties back in with our understanding of what we see in Black Panther, right? The lead character in the novel Fire Dance, which I just was on the slide previously, the lead character in this must undergo cybernetic augmentation to go back to Africa. He goes back to the fictional state of Pan-Africa as part of a military operation. And as such, he becomes a part of that nation state. He comes back and reverses the trajectory of the diaspora. Now this allegory, this kind of allegory is certainly one that's very, very meaningful to me, given my own foundations with Japanese anime and mecha. So looking at cyborgs, looking at Black powered suits, looking at Black enhancement, I find that to be a really, really cool concept, and one that in my dissertation research I've identified as Black mecha. Again, this M-E-C-H-A, Black mechanical prosthetic enhancements and futures. So this is something that I'm continuing to do more research on, continuing to look at as a fascinating way of allegorizing connections between African America and Africa, the continent as well, seeing how these connections can be created. Because to me, at the end of the day, the biggest question is, what is most important about Afrofuturism? Why is Afrofuturism such a big deal? To me, if we want to be very cynical, we can certainly say that something like Black Panther, making over $1 billion at the box office, doing so well internationally, if it makes dollars, it makes sense, right? And if it is going to show the green, perhaps it also sort of can help us to handle this black and white dynamic also, right? That's me being cynical. But if I want to look at it from a more optimistic and idealistic standpoint, Black Panther matters because it helps us to see that Black futures matter, which again helps us to see how Black lives matter. And I think that this is a really important concept for us to be aware of. It's a very important issue for us to be cognizant of, that Blackness is not always inherently reflective. Blackness is not always grounded in notions of the slavery past. It's not always grounded within the sort of complicated situations of urban living in the contemporary American landscape. We might imagine alternatives. We might imagine ways beyond those pasts, and without necessarily sort of cutting those pasts off. Because again, Afrofuturism as such allows us to see and appreciate and understand the past by projecting it forward into the future. So there's a little thing I like to close out with. Y'all know Richard Pryor, right? Richard Pryor is kind of awesome. He's a great stand-up comedian, and was a great stand-up comedian. One of his important kind of sketches that he did was a remark or a riff on the film Logan's Run, science fiction film, Logan's Run. Richard Pryor goes up and he says, yeah, I've seen this movie, Logan's Run. Wasn't no black people in it, set in the future. I guess they won't plan on us to stick around. And fortunately for us, Afrofuturism exists as an alternative. Afrofuturism exists as a means for us to see how we can persist into futures, how we can thrive in the futures, how we can engage our past and utilize that to help us imagine brighter futures. Thank you very much.